Hello, greetings. History of Economic Thought 2, Hillsdale College, and we're continuing with our discussion of the history of macroeconomics, and we'll move now to monetarism. This is lecture part 3 of our series on macroeconomics. And we're going to talk a little bit now about why Keynesianism eventually collapses. And the first part of that story is the attack that comes on it from Milton Friedman and monetarism. That'll be followed by the rational expectations revolution, where we'll see people like Robert Lucas, Thomas Sargent, Neil Wallace, who begin attacking it on theoretical and empirical grounds, and develop the rational expectations arguments. And so we'll see from that things like new classical economics and new Keynesian economics, which is really not very Keynesian. But let's start out with the story of Friedman's monetarism. And for monetarism, we have to go back a little bit farther in history because the origins lie in the quantity theory of money and in its fairly modern statements by Irving Fisher and Knut Wicksell. Those are the people that Friedman relies on. So let's start with Fisher. And Fisher, of course, was at Yale University, an American. He lived 1867 to 1947. Irving Fisher. (1847), and he was the developer of the formal equation of exchange, with which we're all familiar. We know that the money stock of money times the velocity of money is equal to the price level times the amount of output, or GDP, stuff being sold. Well, he theorized that velocity and output will depend upon institutional factors and technological factors. Okay? But then why and how are money and prices linked? And of course, we've seen an argument last semester from Henry Thornton about this. But Fisher develops his take on the idea. And he says, first of all, there's the real balance effect. We'll go over here. This is to explain the link between M and P, the money supply and the price level. And the first thing that Fisher refers to is the real balance effect. And the idea is this. Individuals ask themselves, how much cash should I hold and how much should I spend? It's a choice that they make. Okay, we can think of that as being an equilibrium choice or an optimization choice. How much of my cash do I want to keep on hand and how much will I get rid of? Put into other assets or spend on consumption goods or something. So they choose optimum cash balances, cash balance expenditure trade-off. There's the cash expenditure trade-off. Okay, that's done optimally. If more money enters the system, then cash balances must increase. If new money, we'll say, enters the economy, cash balances, it has to go someplace. Cash balances increase. Great. And in that way, in that sense, to restore equilibrium, they increase spending. They increase their spending. Because they're trying to get back to the optimal balance. And if that one is fixed, remember that Fisher has argued that's determined by things like technology, resources, institutions. If that one's fixed, then it must be that the effect is driving up prices. Okay, This, again, depends on factors of production. It depends on technology. It depends on institutions. That's why he thinks of it as, in effect, being fixed. Increased spending drives up prices. Great. There's the link, the real balance effect, as he calls it. Well, we have to think, too, about the demand for money. And what are the demand for real money balances? Because that demand for money will be this side of the equation. And so for Fisher, the demand for money would be dependent upon first of all, the real income that people have. I'll put Y to represent a person's real income or people's real income. And then secondly, the nominal interest rate. Similar to Thornton, that interest rate, says Fisher, is a cost of holding money. Great. But what is that going to be? What is that real interest rate? Okay, so we've got the cost of holding money plus the amount of real income that people have determining the demand for money. And now the question for Fisher is, what determines this? And we'll clean this up a bit. And in Fisher's version of this, the nominal interest rate must be equal to the real rate plus, I'll abbreviate it this way, the expected inflation rate. So we've got nominal rate of interest that's the interest rate that's observed in the market. And there's the real rate, which, as we saw in previous lectures, is actually dependent upon people's time preferences. And then finally, we've got the expected rate of inflation. If you're getting paid back in dollars that are worth less because of an expansion of the money supply, well, you have to incorporate that into the amount of interest that you want to be paid back if you're making a loan, say. And suppose then that the government decides to stimulate the economy by increasing the amount of cash or the amount of money in the economy or altering the interest rate in some way. Well, in Fisher's idea, here's what happens, is that first of all, step one, we have an interest rate here, and we'll just put the quantity of funds right here. And the initially what happens is there's the demand and supply. It's a loanable funds market. And now the government has increased the money supply. And so we have a drop in that interest rate. Great, stimulus, more borrowing, more activity. But then, says Fisher, that increase, when people catch on to this increase in cash that has come in, there's now more spending as people try to spend down that additional money. And through the real balance effect, what actually happens is we see a shift out of this, and equilibrium will be restored to our, I can invoke the fat point theorem, but that'd be a pretty darn fat point. We'll do it right there. So now what actually happens is that people, that simply is going to generate more spending through the real balance effect, prices increase, people's inflation expectations increase, which is what's going on there. Their expected rate of inflation is now higher, and this shifts out, and really we haven't accomplished anything other than drive up prices, price inflation. Great. Newt-Wicksell also has a development of this. And these two things together, Wicksell has a nice way of arguing for a real balance effect. We'll cover Wicksell a little bit. But these two things are what Milton Friedman is influenced by. And let's see, Wicksell, as we know, previous lectures, Knut Wicksell, Swedish economist, lived 1851, 1926. But he makes this further development, his own development of the real balance effect, and he says, suppose the following. Stock of money increases without a corresponding increase of price. Okay? We simply have, he wants to trace out why prices would change. Well, the first thing that people will do is they'll find that they have people's cash balances increase. Cash balances. Their cash balances increase, and so they are outside of equilibrium. They're more than desired, and their behavioral response is to increase purchases. And also, they will decrease sales. That is, they will work less, they will sell less, they don't care about they've already got more cash than they want. They increase their purchases. This means less stuff on the market. This means more demand on the market. And what does that do? Pushes prices upwards. Prices increase, and until we go back to equilibrium. Equilibrium is restored at some point, and then the process stops. Ludwig von Mises concurs with this. This is an idea that is built into the Austrian business cycle theory and Mises monetary theory. But Mises notes that this necessarily will involve Cantillon effects or not the non-neutrality of money, injection effects. It will have real effects on the kinds and quantities of output. That's what drives the Austrian business cycle theory. But it's otherwise a similar kind of idea. Well, notice that Fisher and Wicksell have both breathed new life into the quantity theory and explained how it would work. And they're in the footsteps of Henry Thornton. They're developing those theoretical links that explain why these things are connected, money and prices. And Milton Friedman builds on that. He launches an all-out attack on Keynesianism. In some ways, he is sometimes thought to be a Keynesian simply because he's building from the Keynesian framework, but he's attacking it. First thing that he does is he attacks the idea of Keynes's consumption function. And he argues in favor of a permanent income hypothesis, that if you suddenly get a windfall of cash, you don't necessarily run out and spend the same amount. You might say, it's not coming again. I will save that for a rainy day. People will engage in consumption smoothing. If you are a student and you're living on loans, you're living on borrowed money, you may be living a little bit higher lifestyle than your current income, which is probably negative in total, would allow. But your income smoothing. This is what Friedman argues. Friedman argues that the Keynesian model is simply wrong in a number of respects. But we're going to look at his story about money from Friedman. And so we'll clear the board here. We've got our preliminaries out of the way. We'll look at what he says about monetarism. And I'll lift that up. But Milton Friedman, 1912 to 2006. And his attack really begins from the money side with a paper that is The Quantity Theory of Money, a Restatement, 1956. In it, he lays out a theory of the demand for money, which is an expanded version of Fisher's theory. And I think I'll not write it all down. It's a mess. No, it's not. Let's do it. for him, the demand for money is going to be equal to some function, it can be expressed this way, of first of all, YP. What's YP? Well, that's the permanent income for which he's argued. How do people expect their permanent income, long-run income to be? And also, what's their wealth, their human capital included, human capital especially, and the nominal interest rate, and expected inflation, as before, the actual price level, and inflation, and finally their preferences for money balances. That might be based on a person's, say, risk assessment or something. If a person's very risk averse, they might want to hold more money than another. It's an expanded version of the theory that comes from Fisher, and he lays this out carefully. Well, how does the cash balance effect work in this theory? Suppose for a moment that we're in equilibrium, says Friedman, and we have a constant rate of expansion of the money supply. So the Federal Reserve, the Monetary Authority, the gold mines are expanding the money supply at the same rate. It's growing at some particular rate. Right? So we start with from an equilibrium position in the economy. We'll start here with constant rate of growth of money supply. The money supply is growing, I don't know, but just whatever, 1%, 2%, who cares? Some percentage. But because it's constant, expected inflation equals actual inflation. People are aware of what is happening. They've learned. They've observed, and they see that it's constant, and so we know that, in other words, the expected inflation rate equals the actual inflation rate. Great. And that's at the rate at which the money supply expands. And so we also know that the nominal interest rate is equal to the real rate plus the expected inflation rate, which happens to be the actual inflation rate. And the real rate of growth of income is constant. That is, if we're thinking about Y, permanent income, put this back up here, MV equals PY. This one's growing at a constant rate, this one's growing at a constant rate, this one's growing at a constant rate. Everybody has it figured out because it's a stable situation. Great. Real income growth is constant. And then one day, something happens. Suppose that the Fed, or whomever the money authority is, suddenly expands the growth rate of the money supply and does it unexpectedly. Okay? If there's an unexpected change in the growth rate of money, money supply M, cash balances increase. Interest rate, real and nominal, both fall. So the people's cash balances increase. They've got more cash. And interest rates fall. And spending increases. for the reasons we've already seen, as people try to restore their equilibrium cash balances. The spending increases means prices rise. And people notice this. And so inflation expectations now begin to change. They begin to adapt, and that pushes the nominal interest rate higher. That one begins to go up. Great. That goes on until the equilibrium is restored. And so great. Well, he lays this theory out in several works. And then he and another economist, Anna Schwartz. Anna Schwartz definitely deserves mention here. Anna Schwartz lived 1915 to 2012. Anna Schwartz, 1915 to 2012. I used to ride the elevator at NYU's economics department at Mercer Hall with her because she worked upstairs in the NBER. She's a great elevator companion. But she and Friedman published A Monetary History of the United States. A Monetary History of the United States, and this is quite an important work because in this work they do empirical analysis. They've argued that Keynes is wrong about money and that the real driving force in the macroeconomy is money supply, not aggregate demand, not fiscal policy, the way that the Keynes had argued, rather. And this is a massive empirical work testing the monetarist ideas here. And the ideas largely hold up. The full name, I got to get the title in, it's from 1867 to 1960. This is the title of the book. And their theory largely holds up and is convincing to many, many people that monetary theory is much more powerful, monetary policy is much more powerful than was ever thought by the Keynesians. Well, this remains an aggregate theory. It does not include the Cantillon effects. So the Austrians and the monetarists really don't, they part company. No love lost between them, although they do have different ideas. They tend, similar ideas, I should say. They tend to be a bit hostile to each other. But there's something else about this, and that is that this has adaptive expectations. People adapt. They observe, they learn and adjust, but the government can surprise and fool them, and people don't catch on to that. It's adaptive expectations. But that money illusion that Keynes refers to must only be a short-term thing, because people will eventually figure this out. That's the argument, part of the argument. And so for the Phillips curve trade-off that many of the Keynesians believe in, they think that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and that the government can stimulate its way. We put inflation on this axis, and we put unemployment on this axis. Unemployment, I'll just abbreviate it that way. And of course, the Phillips curve idea is that the government has a whole choice of positions it could be. They could take high unemployment and low inflation, or high inflation and low unemployment, or somewhere in between. The story that Friedman tells is that that must only be a short-run phenomenon, because people will catch on. And the long-run Phillips curve, says Friedman, must be something like that. And that would be the unemployment rate that we have with when we're at a full employment position, when the economy is fully employed. It's only unexpected and accelerating inflation that could maintain that trade-off until people catch on to what's happening. Once they understand, they'll make adjustments, and it will be back to the point where the amount of output being produced, and therefore the amount of employment, and therefore the amount of unemployment, will be determined by those technological factors and institutional factors and things like that. The real factors. That's the long run Phillips curve. And that's the short run Phillips curve. That's Friedman's argument. Well, great. The bottom line of this, many of the conclusions that Friedman and Schwartz reach, is that first of all, Keynesian fiscal policy is unwieldy and it's wrong. It's subject to lags, first of all, because if there's a downturn in the economy, first the government and economists would have to identify the problem, then they would have to implement a solution, and they'd have to wait for it to take effect. It's going to be too slow. You've got to get Congress to arrange its spending according to upswings and downswings in the economy. Good luck at that. It also ignores the problems of what the incentives are for the decision makers. Why don't they just manipulate those relations to benefit their own political agendas? And it ignores the fact that productivity must matter. Over the long run, it has to matter. You can't spend all of your income, you can't spend all of your effort and resources on burying bottles of cash and digging them up. You have to eat something at some point. Furthermore, say Friedman and Schwartz, the Keynesian story misdiagnoses the problem. And they show that during the Great Depression, there was a severe monetary contraction, 30% of the money supply shrinking. And that people were not holding excess balances of cash the way that Keynes had suggested, that in fact, the Fed was making the Depression bad by withdrawing cash, withdrawing money, allowing it to collapse out of the system. That was not free market activity. That was a Federal Reserve-driven problem. Now, Friedman also argues that monetary policy is more powerful and it's faster, but it's also subject to lags and some of the problems of fiscal policy. And so his true monetarist proposal is that here's what the government should do. The monetary authority should announce a growth rate for money and stick with it and let the economy adjust itself. Forget trying to fine-tune the economy. You'll just make things worse. Most economists are convinced by his point that the Keynesian fiscal policy is not wieldy and that monetary policy is more powerful, but they're not convinced by that idea of get the government out of trying to manage the macroeconomy, and instead the dominant idea becomes manage it through, instead of aggregate demand management, we will manage by monetary policy. That becomes standard in economics. But this story has dealt a tremendous blow to the Keynesian theory, and there are two more that are about to come. Well, one of them is simply that this trade-off that Keynesians expect to be able to make in the 1970s, empirically, just suddenly things go awry. Because instead of being here or here, we turn out to be here with high unemployment and high inflation with a period called stagflation. Keynesianism can't explain that, and Keynesianism has no policy remedy. But something else happens, and that's the rational expectations revolution. And when the rational expectations revolution comes in, it's another death blow to the Keynesian theories. And that's what we'll pick up and cover in the next lecture.